Hey internets, this video is going to explain why you can't actually be a right-wing communist or a Maga communist as it is sometimes called. At least, not if you want to possess an ideology with any level of consistency or sustainability. Because of course, you can claim to be a right-wing communist, and on its face it may seem like the ideas of left-wing economic policy and right-wing cultural ideas aren't necessarily contradictory, at least in the immediate sense. The problem is emphasis on the word immediate sense, because as right-wing communism marches forward, it'll run into a lot of problems that will ultimately force it to fall into the same pitfalls and the same logical failings that the far left runs into. I should also note that this video is part of a collaboration with Praxben in further response to Jackson Hinkle's constant coping about China and falsely claiming that it is an example of successful communism when it in fact is not, which makes this video kind of an extra wild ride because as I was making the video, which originally was just going to be about the problems with right-wing communism, something absolutely hilarious happened. If I had a nickel for every time a commie attempted to refute me, in which they used talking points and subject matter that I was actually already in the middle of making another video refuting those very things they said in a follow-up, I would have 2 nickels. But it's weird that it happened twice. The first time it happened was with Bad Panda, when he tried to refute my video on the Holodomor using Mark Tauger as a source in order to refute the source that I was using, which was interesting because I was already in the process of making a video responding to Mark Tauger. And then Bad Panda shows up and he makes a video with his source being Mark Tauger, the very essay I was already in the process of making a response to. And now it has happened again with Jackson Hinkle. I was already in the process of making a nice libertarian theory video for you all to enjoy on why right-wing communism doesn't actually make any sense. And then along comes Jackson Hinkle to respond to my video on why China is not actually successful communism. And in that video response from Jackson Hinkle to me, he commits all of the fallacies and showcases all of the problems with right-wing communism that I was already going to talk about. So yeah, very weird, kind of fun that it's happened twice. But before we get started, first I'd like to give a shout out to Young Americans for Liberty. The YAL National Convention of 2026 is going on. It is going to happen at July 28th to 30th at Xavier University in Cincinnati, Ohio, and applications for it are currently open right now. This is probably the best convention you can possibly attend if you are a young libertarian in any way, and the connections you can build from going to one of these things are potentially priceless. It includes actual well-known speakers, and it is also somewhat exclusive, so you have to actually apply. The seats are limited. If you are interested in this in any way, I recommend applying very soon because they do tend to fill up and sell out. So a link to the application will be in the description below. Anyways, before we really get into what Hinkle said and why he's wrong and why it doesn't really make sense to be a MAGA communist, we have to first start with a little bit of theory. Mainly, what does it even mean to be left or right wing anyways? Because, you know, that's kind of an important question when it comes to this issue. And it's one that's something that libertarians, especially myself as a younger libertarian, we kind of have a temptation to put ourselves above and kind of be that little eagle looking down on the problem and saying, oh, we're above the whole left and right dichotomy. We're smarter than everybody else. The whole left-right dichotomy is false to begin with, and thus the question of whether or not you can be a right-wing communist or a left-wing libertarian is ultimately just meaningless conjecture, especially since there's pretty good evidence that the meaning of left and right originally actually got reversed a very long time ago back in France in the 1700s. But the thing is, that doesn't necessarily mean that it should be viewed as meaningless, because even though it got reversed a bit, that reversal ultimately did have a reason behind it. To make a really complex topic short, it really just comes down to your stance on equality and hierarchy. Left-wing ideology ultimately favors economic equality of outcome, and thus advocates that it is moral to use aggression in order to redistribute power and wealth from those who have to those who have not, often under the claim that wealth inequalities creates a quote-unquote unjust hierarchies. So for example, if you believe in using the government to force that kind of equality to exist, then you are ultimately a leftist. Whereas on the flip side, the right believes that no, that is not correct, that it is not right to use aggression to force equality of outcome, that you cannot steal from Steve to give to Joe just because Joe has less than Steve. And this generally also comes with the belief that hierarchy is good actually, and that inequality to some degree is actually natural. This is probably why the original meanings of left and right got flipped so quickly, because originally during the French National Assembly, the leftists were the ones who were against the ruling hierarchy and against the existing royals. But the thing is, in order to actually enforce that lack of hierarchy, you ironically have to actually create a hierarchical structure in order to enforce equality. And thus, it is ultimately an authoritarian philosophy, as I kind of already pointed out in previous videos, and why you can't actually be an anarchist and left-wing either. TLDR, the idea of leftist anarchy kind of runs into the immediate problem that equality isn't natural, and thus you need authority to create equal outcomes, and thus leftist theory is necessarily authoritarian. Those who call themselves leftist anarchists will completely flip out on you when you point this out to them, but they're wrong and they don't matter. So anyways, this is ultimately why Das Kapital is generally considered the most left-wing thing ever written, because the concept of surplus labor value being extracted from the worker by the owner of the means of production, and having that surplus labor value being defined as a form of theft, provides a moral framework for which the leftist creation of equality by force can be viewed as morally justified. This is why communists are so big on a collectivist model of society. The basic idea is that the state represents the will of the people, thus representing the collective, and thus by the state owning the means of production, the fruits of the workers' labor can thus be more fairly distributed. And the entire point, again, really just comes down to the moral claim towards equality, which is also where the very idea of being a right-wing communist immediately runs into an issue, because being right-wing doesn't necessarily care about creating equality or stopping the existence of hierarchy. Why even intervene in the economy to put a stop to the mentioned extraction of surplus labor value in the first place? Leftists who call themselves leftists, of course, have the simple answer: to create equality of outcome. But that's not really a core right-wing thing. Rather, the right-wing claim is more or less that not having equality, and instead focusing more on individual freedom, is morally just based on the consistency of property rights, but also because this ultimately justifies a more free market policy, where you don't have the government intervening to create equality, and you don't have the government coming in to control the quote-unquote means of production. The defense of this is often pointed out in the famous quote, "A society that puts equality before freedom will get neither. A society that puts freedom before equality will get a high degree of both." And so, in order to be a right-wing communist, one must necessarily viciously deny this statement to be true. The only claim that the Maga communists can have to being right-wing and communist really just comes down to trying to claim that communism actually reduces scarcity better than capitalism does, which I believe immediately explains why the Maga communist types seem to have taken to such an obsessive liking to the extra shiny Chinese cities. They look at all these nice-looking Chinese skylines, and then look to the fact that China is ruled by a quote-unquote Chinese Communist Party, and whoa-ho-ho, the communism has reduced scarcity better than capitalism because these cities look better than the capitalist cities. Which brings me to finally the first clip I want to show with Jackson Hinkle's rambling, and how it shows that Maga communists have a very simplified view of economics.
He's like, oh, well, China is actually successful now because they adopted Friedmanite economics. And I'm like, in what world is China, ascribing to the worldview, to the writings, to the works of Milton Friedman? Let's be real here. In China, all of the land is owned by the state. Does that sound like capitalism? Does that sound like Milton Friedman? Where did Milton Friedman write about that? The only land that is not owned by the state in China is owned by like collective farm workers in rural communities. Okay. So yeah, that's apparently Milton Friedman. What else do we have? He said that China's Friedmanite economics. China, they have like 4,300 different banks, 4,400 different banks. I think it's about 15 or 17 are categorized as private. All of the other banks are publicly state-owned, right? And by private, they mean that less than 50% owned by the state. So everyone kind of knows that around 30% of a company, if you have enough shadow companies that have enough stock in the company, it can technically be defined as still a state-owned enterprise. So 17 banks out of over 4,300 are private. The other 4,300 roughly are all publicly owned, state-owned banks. In China, they have rigorous 5-year economic plans, which all state-owned enterprises, partially state-owned enterprises, and private companies must adhere to. And if you don't adhere to it, you're going to have a very big problem, meaning like...
So yeah, everything that Hinkle just said is painfully irrelevant. Mainly because it's just a straw man. When economists say that a country is a capitalist country or a communist country or whatever, when that statement is coming from a serious economist anyway, it is almost always just an oversimplification to make things easier for normies to understand. But of course, in reality, it's much more complicated than that. In reality, you have to look at policy in a case-by-case basis, and in this case specifically whether or not it is a capitalist policy or a communist policy, and what specifically that policy does. So for instance, when an economist, or in many cases a historian, looks at the USSR and says that the USSR was a communist country or a communist nation, that doesn't mean that they were a pure communist nation in the sense, and in fact many communists and many socialists today will actually deny that and claim that they were a state capitalist society, which in many ways they were. It's just that they had enough communist policies that you can break it down as an oversimplification and call them communist, but that doesn't mean that all of their policies were actually communist. It is just a way to simplify it, which unfortunately opens a door for dishonest people to take advantage of that, and then they refute the oversimplification and act as if they've refuted the concept entirely, which of course is not true at all. So here's a less simplified version, to the point of making it clear that what Hinkle is saying here is basically nonsensical. A communist policy in terms of economic planning is essentially a collectivist policy, whereas a capitalist policy is an individualistic one based on negative freedom. Or another way to look at it is how Hans Hermann Hoppe defines it in his book on a theory of socialism and capitalism, where socialism is defined as an institutionalized policy of aggression against the holders of private property rights by the non-producers or non-contractors of that property, and thus the state controls how the resources of that private property is used. Whereas a capitalist policy is simply the respect of private property rights. It is simply the absence of that external control by the non-productive class. And so of course every single economy in the world cannot be simply explained by simply saying, oh, this is a communist country or this is a capitalist country. That is again always an oversimplification. In reality, markets are complex, economies are complex. Every economy in every country in the world is to some degree a mixed market between capitalist and socialist policies, to some degree or another. And so when Hinkle bumbles in and says, oh, the CCP owns land, and the CCP owns a portion of every company, and then provides absolutely no policy analysis beyond that whatsoever, and simply implies that that means that communism works, that tells you absolutely nothing. It is an utterly meaningless argument. All he's really telling you is that China is a mixed market economy like every other economy, and he's just cherry-picking parts that are socialist policies. Whoop-de-doo-dazzle. It has absolutely nothing to do with the main question, the central point, which is whether or not those policies are helping to reduce scarcity or are they making scarcity worse. And you will notice that Hinkle provided absolutely no explanation whatsoever to how specifically those policies he mentioned made things better. Because we can play the exact same game in reverse on the United States, for example. Banks are owned in China by the state. Okay, well, you also have the Federal Reserve in the United States. So what? Two socialist policies of two different mixed markets. Whoop-de-doo-dazzle. Again. Because, well, ultimately, the argument he's trying to pull here is just that the Chinese Communist Party has communism in the name, therefore it's successful communism. He's just padding it with random cherry-picked examples to make it seem like that's not his argument, but that ultimately is his argument. Nobody's actually arguing that China is a Friedmanite country. The argument is that it's specifically Friedmanite policies, or a movement towards free market policies, that are what helped China come out of poverty. Which is an argument that Jackson Hinkle does not touch in his entire 50-minute response to me. No, seriously, I actually kind of wish I was joking here. I watched his entire response a couple times over, and his entire response, the reasoning behind it, is based on this misconception within the first few minutes. He legitimately made an entire 50-minute response video that completely ignores the central point of the argument being made. At no point does he attempt to explain why the policies that led to Chinese success were not free market policies. At no point does he actually counter the main argument that I had to say. It is legitimately a 50-minute straw man. Seriously, if you watch his video while keeping in mind that the argument is not whether or not China is a Friedmanite country, but rather that the argument is whether or not those specific policies are what helped China bring itself out of poverty, Hinkle does not actually say anything to counter that claim, which really shows when he gets to talking about Chinese special economic zones. So take a look at this clip.
So he says that, so his whole argument in this video is that China's economic success is as a result of special economic zones, which is ludicrous on its face if you just look at how much of the annual GDP is generated by state-owned enterprises. It's ludicrous on its face when you look at that graph that we were looking at earlier, for example, and there's the Heritage Foundation even admits that In a period of 1990 to 2003, it was found that only around 7% of all listed firms in China could truly be considered private. These companies are allowed to have access to private revenue, but their control rights are strongly within the hands of the state and should therefore be considered state firms. And they explained how by looking at specific companies and specific collaborative, joint cooperation agreements between state-owned enterprises and, in some cases, private companies and some cases foreign-owned companies. So his whole argument is that these special economic zones somehow are the result of China's economic success, and therefore that means that like capitalism wins.
No, actually, that's not the whole argument. Rather, that is an oversimplification. It's not so much just that it's special economic zones, but rather that it's more specifically that it was free market policies that helped China become more successful. Because again, when an economist says that a country is a capitalist economy or a socialist economy, that is again just an oversimplification. That is based entirely just on the average of their policies. Really, there is capitalist policy and socialist policy. America isn't actually a capitalist country, and China isn't actually a communist country. It's just an oversimplification given based on their policies. And the reasoning Hinkle gave in regards to the special economic zones completely ignored the reasoning behind that. Because it's not a question of whether or not China still has state-owned enterprises. They do. Of course they do. We know that they do. He's not telling us anything that we don't already know. The question is whether or not China's SEZ policies were a reduction in socialist policies or an increase in socialist policies. That's really the only thing that matters here. And when we look at these policies, we clearly see that they allowed for more FIEs, so foreign invested enterprises, relaxed foreign investment law, allowed for more special administration measures. And so, for example, if you want to own a restaurant in China, you actually can now, and it mainly started with the special economic zones. You don't necessarily have to have it be state-owned. You can have a WFOE in China, or a wholly foreign-owned enterprise. And the areas of the economy in China where it started out not being mandatory to have it being state-owned is, you guessed it, the Chinese special economic zones. And while the land for your business will be state-owned, it is still leased for commercial space in those zones, with typically a 20 to 70 year lease given. But you can still register a WFOE in those areas for a limited liability corporation in China. And if you were to try and go back in time and do that under Mao's tongue, good luck. Yeah, spoiler alert, not happening. And of course, under the special economic zones, the profits were also more privatized, and you could have more foreign investments. The basic TLDR is that they adopted more capitalist policies. Again, absolutely nobody is arguing that China has become a capitalist country, and when you hear that, it is again just an oversimplification based on the average. What you have to do in order to figure this out is to just look at the SEZ policies and ask yourself, okay, could you do these things during the reign of Mao before these policies were enacted? And like I said, no, of course you could not. For example, one of the things that Hinkle brings up is McDonald's. He proudly brings up McDonald's and how it's still partially state-owned, 52% or whatever. And he tries to say that, oh, that means it's successful socialism. But he's completely ignoring the point of the argument. It's not whether or not China still has socialist policies. They obviously still do. No serious economist is denying that, unless they are, of course, an economicist. Rather, the point, the entire argument that Hinkle is basically just dancing around is whether or not they could do that, whether or not there was less socialist policies after the special economic zones came to be. Were those capitalist policies or were they socialist policies? And the answer becomes obvious by looking at any of his examples, but again, we'll just look at McDonald's. How did McDonald's come to China? Oh, it came in 1990 in Shenzhen, specifically as a result of the special economic zones policies. Because before then, under Mao Zedong, you couldn't have this private-public state partnership. It would have to be entirely by the state. They wouldn't have, Mao didn't allow any kind of private enterprise or any kind of capitalist policy or Western influence, as they would call it, at all. And so any kind of foreign direct investment systems just didn't really exist. And so then that just brings up the question, is moving from a policy that is entirely a centrally planned economy with state monopoly over everything, with private ownership of business essentially outlawed, and no system to remit profits abroad, to a system where you have a partnership with the state but still have some ownership of your company and have to share some of your profits with the state? Is that an increase of capitalist policies, or is that an increase of socialist policies? Well, obviously that is an increase of capitalist policies. That is an obvious reduction of socialism. Just because it's not completely 100% a reduction in socialism does not mean that it wasn't a reduction in socialism, and does not mean that that means that China is successful communism. And Hinkle's just totally ignoring that. Again, he does not address the central point of the argument at all during his entire 50-minute rant. Rather, what's going on here is that Hinkle seems to think that if he just mentions enough aspects of the Chinese economy that has state involvement, implement and how it works, then China becomes a communist country, and the fact that the SEZ policies worked by reducing socialist policies in those areas, that fact just magically goes away or something. Which means that his argument is effectively just a bizarre retrocausal compositional fallacy, where if he just cherry picks enough while deliberately ignoring the time when those policies he's cherry picking were implemented, then that makes China successful communism. And no, that's just objectively false reasoning. You don't get to ignore the fact that China adopted some free market policies and that those policies resulted in them gaining greater economic growth just because they still have some socialist policies. And you don't get to just ignore the causation of those policies either, like he does when he looks at my graph. If you watch the whole video, he gets to the point where I show the graph where it shows that the increase in privatization led to greater economic growth, reduction in poverty, etc., and he just deliberately hand waves it away. He doesn't understand the graph at all. He makes no attempt to analyze it in good faith. And you can tell that this is what he's saying from this clip right here. These were zones where they would abolish their communist policies in terms of how the market would function. And so while these areas would still be under the wing of the CCP, these areas were now under a capitalist experiment. And so more free trade.
How are they under the wing of the Communist Party, but also under a capitalist experiment? That doesn't even make sense.
Yes, he unironically said that. Again, if you think I'm taking him out of context here, feel free to watch the whole video. But yeah, that is essentially his argument. He's genuinely ignoring the fact that mixed markets exist, and the fact that pretty much every country is a mixed market. But more importantly, back on topic here, why did they do this? Why am I responding to Hinkle's attempt to refute my claim that China is not successful communism in a video that is essentially meant to debunk the idea of Maga communism? Well, because this beautifully showcases how to be a quote-unquote right-wing communist, again, requires vicious denial of reality. The evidence is overwhelming that when you adopt capitalist policies into your market, that those policies reduce scarcity. This has been proven over and over and over and over and over and over again. I will link several of these studies in the description below. It's one of those things that economists don't even really debate, even economists who are somewhat left-leaning, with the exception of outright Marxists. It's just one of those facts that has been empirically proven to the moon and back, which is very telling because there is a massive incentive for authoritarians to disprove this fact. Corrupt politicians who want to get their grubby little fingers onto the economy would love to disprove the notion that their aggressive interference overall causes things to become worse. And these are some very powerful people in very privileged positions, and yet they have continuously failed to disprove this. And that is a big problem for someone to be a quote-unquote right-wing communist, because the leftists, at least again, have the moralistic angle of, oh, we're doing this for the sake of equality and fairness and utopia and prancing unicorns and la 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 la. And while of course there's many arguments against that being wrong, it is at least a philosophical argument. But to be a right-wing communist, you have to argue it entirely based on consequentialism. But consequentially, it doesn't work. It does not reduce scarcity better than capitalism, and it is therefore not conducive to low time preference values that are compatible with right-wing ideals. As in many ways, that's the entire point. One of the main reasons the rightists support hierarchy and view hierarchy and inequality as a good thing is mainly because those things are sustainable. That's kind of a big difference in there. It's not just the moral angle, it's also the sustainability angle. But if you are supporting an economic system that consumes the future of the next generation, how the heck can you be right-wing? The answer is you can't. And so the biggest reason why being a Maga communist doesn't really work is essentially just an inverse of the reasoning Hans Hermann Hoppe gave as to why it doesn't really make sense to be a left-wing libertarian in his book on getting libertarianism right. It essentially boils down to the fact that sure, you can claim to be a libertarian in support of free market capitalism and at the same time be a total pervert degenerate and drug addict. The problem though is that in a free market-based society with as little government as possible, that also means that people have freedom of association, and it is essentially economically sensible for people to actually just physically remove degenerates, because they are ultimately an economic drain. Because high time preference behavior, in the long run, by almost definition of high time preference behavior, will eventually cost more resources than it is worth. And thus a successful libertarian society is a society that physically removes degeneracy. And thus libertarians who wish to be successful must be necessarily, to some degree, right-wing and have low time preference values. and recognize that while people have a right to be degenerate, that doesn't mean that they have a right to be tolerated, and thus they do not have a right to access to society. And likewise, on the flip side, sure, you can not be a total degenerate, you could not be a drug addict loser, and you could live a trad right-wing lifestyle as much as you want. Let's just say a typical nuclear family home. You can do all those things, but if you're espousing communist economic policy ideals, then, well, those economic policy ideals will ultimately consume your children's future, because they are not conducive to the reduction of scarcity. And thus the MAGA communist runs into the exact same problem as the degenerate left libertarian, in that both are prioritizing immediate gratification and thus contributing to the decay of society just in different ways, but ultimately to the same effect. But here's the interesting thing. MAGA communism, when we're thinking about the two, is actually the worst of the two. Because to be a socialist, to be a communist, will actually ultimately result in you coming to the same weird conclusions as the woke left anyways, which Hinkle actually does. Take a look at this clip.
China kind of went through some stuff. They kind of had like a different system that was governing over them. They had some sort of threats that were levied against them for an extended period of time. We can look at modern Chinese history and you can pick whichever one you want to dive into. I mean, there's too many to count. You have the first Opium War, 1839 to 1842. You have the Dogra Tibetan War, an internal conflict, ethnic conflict. You have the Taiping Rebellion. You have Second Opium War. You have this very strong foreign intervention from countries, the most powerful countries all across the world. Panthay Rebellion, Dungan Revolt, another interethnic conflict, Neon Rebellion, Sino-French War. You have the first Sino-Japanese War. You have the Boxer Rebellion. You have the 1911 Revolution. You have the warlord era, 12 years of just like actual warlordism, conflicts all across the country for over 12 years straight, where it's just absolute chaos and madness and warlordism all across the country.
Okay, so a bunch of cherry-picked examples of wars and issues that China faced. Pretty silly argument because you can basically do the same thing for every other country. For instance, he brings up Japan. I mean, Japan got nuked in World War II, and yet they still managed to build back just fine. Well, the reason this matters, and the reason I bring it up, rather than just ignoring this as it is just yet another example of cherry-picking on its face, is because it's also an example of a very common leftist tactic that I like to call unfalsifiable excuses, in order to justify a concept of systemic victimhood. And it's especially loved by the communist types, because any time that their system fails, they can always just look to something bad that happened in the past and just blame that. It's an argument I pointed out before, and it's very nefarious in, again, how it's unfalsifiable. Anybody can say something ridiculous like, oh, I stubbed my toe back in 1992, and it gave me such great emotional pain and PTSD from stubbing my toe back in 1992 that is the reason why I am unable to succeed in life. And that is, of course, a very ridiculous excuse to be a failure at life. But the thing is, you technically can't disprove that argument. Even though it's obviously ridiculous to any rational person, it has a layer of subjectivity behind it, just enough subjectivity, but there's a human action element to it that you can't actually disprove. And commies always take advantage of this to point to something and claim that that's the reason why their system didn't work, completely ignoring the context of the history. The crimes and evils of Mao Zedong and how many people he murdered and how his policies directly led to people's deaths and directly led to Chinese economic failure is very well documented. But really the issue here is the reasoning behind it, because it's basically the same reason that the far woke left uses to reach their conclusions. You see, the issue here is that because socialist policies are such massive failures, they have to find something to blame, and thus they must always turn to some degree to the same equity fallacy and the same envy towards success that led the woke left to their conclusions and their identity politics ideology, which honestly may very well be the bigger contention of fraudulence with MAGA communism, because they actually are woke. They actually do still believe in the same cringy things that the woke left believes in. They just refuse to push it to its logical conclusions, which allows them to maintain the facade of a more based personality as opposed to being more cringe. But the logical conclusions of their beliefs leads them to believe the same stuff. So collab collective guilt, anti-white racism, id-pol entitlement, third worldism. They still believe all of these things. And if you don't believe me, you can just look at some of Jackson Hinkle's Twitter posts. Like this one right here. South Africa's Julius Malema and former President Jacob Zuma unite ahead of the funeral of MME Martha Matlanto Malema. If we don't unite now, we will be slaves forever. And then I have defended Julius Malema and the EFF for years, even getting angry that other people have not. So why does this matter? Why is it relevant? Well, if you don't know, this Malema guy is the same guy behind the Shoot the Boer incident. He's the same anti-white, genocidal psychopath, blames white people for all of his economic problems. Essentially, he is the living embodiment of the logical conclusions of the equity fallacy, as well as also the equality fallacy, the same lines of thinking that leads one to woke ideology. He's probably one of the worst examples of anti-white racism in existence today. And here's the allegedly based Jackson Hinkle supporting this guy and being proud to support this guy. And honestly, this should surprise no one really, because communist ideology at its root, at its core, requires you to some degree to look at the one who has less and to view that as an injustice, and then to always blame that dynamic for all of society's ills. Hence why they fall for the same false conclusion that the woke left falls for, which is that the government is corrupt and the solution is more government, because they don't actually understand the structure of the system or how it works, and so looking at everything through a lens of critical theory and collective guilt is the fallacy that they are doomed to fall for. Now, of course, there's a lot of other silly arguments that Jackson Hinkle makes. For instance, apparently liking anime and video games makes you a Redditor or something, as if those fandoms didn't exist on the internet long before Reddit existed. Just kind of weird, dumb arguments that are just obviously meant to be insults, not even really worth responding to. But also because really the point here is just to showcase the problem with MAGA communism. You cannot be a MAGA communist without engaging in extreme economic illiteracy, but also just refusing to push your cultural beliefs to their logical conclusions. Where Hinkleites are going is absolutely the same direction as the woke left, because ultimately you cannot be a communist without heading in that direction. The ideology demands that you eventually take on a victimhood mindset as an excuse for all of your failures. But if you want to see more on this conversation, especially since Hinkle and his fans really tried very hard to refute me on a very simple thing, to be honest, then that is where Praxben's video comes into play. One of Hinkle's fans tried to prove again that communism is successful because of China, and Hinkle actually cited this video in his response to me, and used pretty much the same reasoning, and of course Praxben came in and pretty handedly debunked it. So be sure to check his video out if you want some more context on this. But for now, that is all. I'll probably do more videos on this in the future because unfortunately it does seem that the whole MAGA communism thing seems to be on the rise, which sadly does not surprise me due to just complete and total lack of economic education in the West these days. So I'll be taking it as it goes. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe, and know that you can support my content on Subscribestar, Ko-Fi, or by becoming a member of the channel, or by buying some merch. And also finally remember that you can check out YALCON. A link to that will be in the description below. But for now, that is all. Thanks again. Till next time.